Welcome to the show. Today, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt on bias. What's going on in the brain that creates and maintains bias? How does bias alter what we feel and even alter what we can even see? Also, bias is actually contagious. How and why did we evolve bias in the first place? I ask some uncomfortable questions during this episode, but honestly, I think we come away with a cleaner, more scientific understanding. And she gets robbed during this episode, which is probably a first for anybody on any podcast ever. Enjoy this interview here with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt on the Jordan Harbinger Show. Yeah, when you wrote this book, the world wasn't on fire, at least not much as it is right now.
That's true. A lot has changed. A lot has changed.
I assume you're more busy than usual.
That's a fair assessment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, bias training right now it's pretty hot, or bias research is pretty hot right now, and I'm guessing you won't have any trouble getting funding for any of the stuff you're going to do in the next decade, probably by now.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's true in one way, and in other ways it isn't. So I feel like people are focused on bias and issues of race and inequality and all of that, but as far as the research goes, I don't know that people always turn to research to try to understand the issues. And so they're sort of looking at like funding, traditional civil rights organizations as they should. They're looking at, funding, community organizations and they're, that kind of thing. And so they associate, issues of race and inequality, with civil rights, right? But not so much science. And so that's what I'm finding. People do email me all the time to come in to give, presentations or not come in anymore, but I virtually give presentations on racial bias and so forth. But I don't know. It's an interesting kind of world we're living in where, a lot of people just sort of see it only as an issue of, civil rights and that kind of thing. And then other people are sort of thinking about it as like, what do we do? What are the solutions to this in our workplace? And so I get a lot of those calls.
Your book starts with kind of a sad story about your own son thinking that this man might rob the plane. Can you take us through that? It's a good way to start off, I think.
Yeah, so this is a story. So this took place when my son was just 5 years old, and he was really excited about, riding on this airplane with mommy. And so we get on the airplane and he's like looking all around and he's checking everybody out. And he sees this man and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like daddy." So I look at this guy and he doesn't look anything at all like my husband, like nothing at all, right? And so then I start to look around on the plane and I realized that this man was the only Black man on the plane. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have a little talk with my son about how not all Black people look alike, right? So I'm getting ready to have this talk and I'm trying to, think in my mind about like adjusting the language so that he would understand. But before I started to lecture him, I paused and I thought, children see the world in a different way from adults, right? They don't, they haven't been conditioned year after year to kind of absorb things in certain ways. And I thought, well, maybe my son is seeing something that I'm not. Like maybe there is some resemblance there, right, between this man and my husband that I'm just missing. So I decide I'm going to look at this guy and I'm going to give it a shot. And I'm looking for any kind of resemblance. So I look at his height and there was no resemblance there. He's about 4 inches shorter than my husband. Look at his weight, nothing there. Facial features, nothing. Skin color, no resemblance. And then I look at his hair. And this guy has long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And my husband shaves his head.
Okay.
I thought, all right, so I looked at my son. I'm like, you're going to get the talk, right? So I'm all ready to give him the talk. But before I could say anything, my son, he looks up at me and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "What?" It was just, I just couldn't believe it. And I said, "What did you say?" And he says it again. "Well, I hope that man doesn't rob the plane." And I said, Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, well, why would you say that? And he looked at me with this really sad face and he said, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. So we're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next, right? So this association between blackness and crime, made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old, and it makes its way into all of our children and to all of us, and that's how I start the book out, because I feel like it's a story that really underscores just how prevalent
Mhm.
bias is, and how damaging it can be.
It seems almost impossible that that would have made its way into the mind of a 5-year-old, but that just shows you how pervasive these is it stereotypes, or is it just what else is kind of going on? Like, how can that happen with where a kid is black, has two black parents that are you're a doctor at Stanford that studies, it's not like you have a bunch of family members that are like affiliated with gangs and stuff, and he's getting it from them, and they live in the house. Like, where does it come from?
Yeah, my husband's a law professor, so
Yeah, I mean, like,
well, yeah.
what?
So where did he get that? I mean, a lot of people feel like, oh, well, we all get that. Our children pick this up from
Mm,
media, and I feel like that's true, but it's not the only place they get it. Like I feel like there's a way in which when we say that it's a cop out, to some
mhm,
extent, because they're getting it also from us. I mean, they're getting it from sort of watching how we react to people and how we move through the world. I have another son who, when he was in first grade, he asked me, he says, well, do you think, he says, Mommy, do you think, people see black people in a different kind of way? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, I don't know. He says, I just feel like there's something different. And so I
hmm.
asked him, I said, well, why don't you sort of think about the last time you felt that way? Because I need an example. And so he was thinking about it, and he said, yeah, well, remember last week, and we went to the grocery store, and we went to this grocery store in a white neighborhood. And he says, I remember being in the grocery store and a black man came in, and people kind of stayed far away from him. There was like, he talked about it, this invisible force field being around this man, because he was really into Star Wars then. And so he was like, yeah. And he says when he got in line, when the black man got in line, his was the shortest line for a long time because he thought people didn't want to be close to him. And I said, well, what do you think that means? And he thought about it, and he thought about it, and he says, I think it's fear.
Mm.
So, I mean, he didn't get that from television. Again, he got that from watching how people react to one another, right? He's a kid. I mean, and kids, that's what their job is, to try to, correlate what goes with what. And he sensed that when there was a black person, in the space, that it was different from a white person being in that space. And he got that sense from how we move through the world, right? And so they're taking hints from us about who is to be feared, who is valued, who is okay, that kind of thing. So it's us too, not just the media.
I want to sort of separate racism from implicit bias, because I think a lot of people will say, oh, well, if you have any kind of bias, it's because you have racist tendencies. But that, according to your book that I read, that's not true at all. I mean, it's just implicit bias is something that humans have, not just racist people have.
That's right. That's right. So we define implicit bias, or some people call it unconscious bias,
Hmm.
as the beliefs and feelings we have about social groups that can influence our decision making and our actions, even when we're not aware of it. Right. So you don't have to be conscious of it. It doesn't have to be intentional. You don't have to mean to do people harm, but you could still have this bias that actually does do harm. And so that's why we're interested in studying it as social scientists.
A lot of people are down on the police right now, and I don't suppose you've caught that in the news. And and the book, again written several years ago, was includes the story of this police officer who accidentally profiles himself. Can you take us through that? I thought that was really interesting, and says a lot about what profiling actually is when you accidentally do it to yourself.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So this was a black police officer who shared this story with me once, and this is a story about him being undercover. And so he said he
Ah.
was, out undercover, and he noticed, this man in the distance, that didn't seem right. And he said the man seemed similar to him. So he had, he's black, he had the same build, he was about the same height, and so forth. But he said that this guy seemed like he was armed and dangerous, right? And he also said the guy was really disheveled. His hair was uncombed, he had on tattered clothing, and he just didn't seem right. And so he wanted to keep his eye on him. And so he noticed him, from a distance. He was kind of up. This guy was like, up on this hill, sort of right outside of this tall office building. And so the office building had those like, they were like mirrored walls, like glass
Hmm.
walls. And so anyway, so he noticed the guy up there. And so he starts to, approach the guy. And then when he gets close to the office building, the guy kind of disappears. And so this made the cop really nervous because he couldn't see him, but he thought he was dangerous. And so he's like, oh, where is he? Right. And so then he notices the guy again, but this time he's inside the building. And so he's looking inside the building, and he noticed that, when he sped up, the guy sped up. And then when the cop slowed down, this guy would slow down. And so he's like, okay, what's up with this guy, right? So he decides he's going to turn and confront him, right? So he stops in his tracks, he turns, and he confronts the guy inside the building. And he told me a shock went through him, because when he looked at the guy's eyes, he realized he was looking at his own eyes. He had been profiling himself that entire time. He's looking at himself right through the mirrored glass. And so it was just amazing. It really kind of shows us how deep this is, right? Like it's something, once again, that it's not about bad people. It's not about your desire, to do someone harm, but you can absorb, you know, this Black Crime Association in this way. Like a cop can absorb that, right? Even though he's Black, by, just, doing his job as a cop, right? So if you're focused on African Americans, for example, as a cop, as you're trying to solve crime, these are the people you're going to see as suspicious. And what was so amazing in this case is that he saw himself as suspicious. He was the image that fit the person who was criminal.
Which I guess speaks well to his ability to dress as an undercover cop, because he looked the part of the criminal even from a distance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of unbelievable. Because I when I read this, I thought there's no way that I would ever look at myself and feel and not recognize myself or see something that wasn't there. But that's what everybody thinks about bias. Like, oh, I don't have that because I know about this. I read a book on bias, and therefore I had a bias training at work. Therefore, I'm not subject to this anymore because I know it exists. So thereby magically, but it's funny because we never really argue that with other things. We never say, well, I know about gravity, so I can fly now, right? But we tell we say that about bias all the time. Well, oh no, I'm not racist because I know about bias, and so I just mitigate that somehow magically.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. Like, yeah, your knowledge of bias doesn't make you immune to it, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like something that evolves over time, and we'll get to that. I want to talk about the other race effect, the idea that even small children can recognize faces of their own race better than other races. And I recognize this to some extent when I moved to California. This is not a politically correct story, but when I moved to California from New York and Michigan, I really thought that a lot of Asian people looked so similar. I didn't understand. I was like, I'm never going to get used to this. I can't really tell Vietnamese and Korean and Japanese apart. And honestly, I couldn't even tell you if I had two different Asian neighbors unless they were standing next to each other, because I just couldn't really, there was like, it was like my brain didn't have enough compartments. It was
Right.
just like everybody who was Asian went into this one compartment. And I noticed that didn't happen with African American people. So I thought for sure, well, if this can't just be a bias thing, because I can tell Black people apart, I can't tell Asian people apart. And I realize now that I grew up with a lot of African American people in karate class, and I had friends who are African American. So that kind of thing was different for me. That kind of experience was different for me. And I told my mom about this, and she told me this, what I can only assume is kind of a horrifying story of my grandpa's funeral. I think I was 3 or 4 years old. My dad invited a lot of guys from work. He worked at Ford. And there was a guy there named Ernie who was Black. And I shook his hand and I looked at my hand, and Ernie said, "It doesn't come off. Don't worry." And I barely remember this. I had to wait for my mom to tell me. Apparently it cracked everyone up at the funeral, but it's something little kids do. Just like, you're just fascinated. There's this giant guy he was probably like 6'5", or at least for my little frame, he looked enormous. And he was the only Black guy that I'd ever seen in real life. I'd never seen that at age 3 or age 4, however old I was. And so, but it was just something that clearly, again, as a kid, I looked at the world in a different way. And now I'm married to a woman who's Chinese, ethnically Chinese. I mean, she's from Taiwan, and all my in-laws and extended family are Asians. And I'm just thinking, how did I not know that these people look different? It's so obvious and so clear now. Like, what was I thinking? But I wasn't 4. I was 34, right? Like, how did I not get it? I don't know.
Well, a lot of it's just about exposure, like you said.
Yeah.
And I had a similar experience when I was a kid. I wasn't as young as you, but when I was 12, my parents decided we were going to move from an all Black neighborhood to an all white neighborhood. And I was nervous about like moving to the neighborhood and about like how I would be received and whether I would be, accepted, whether I'd have friends and all of that. But it's interesting because the kids there were all friendly, but I still had problems making friends because, I could not tell their faces apart. So my brain didn't have practice, at recognizing white faces because everybody in my life up until that point was African American, and so it took my brain a while to kind of catch up to the new experience I was having. And so, after being presented, with one white face after another, my brain slowly was able to distinguish among them. But it took practice.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. It must be, it seems weird because America's so diverse, and yet here we are, like, not able to tell our Asian neighbors apart, or not able to tell our white friends apart in our neighborhood that we go to school with for the first 3 weeks or however long it takes to sort of acclimate. Do we know, by the way, how long that familiarity takes? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's research showing that infants, so babies, right, as young as 3 months old, will show a preference for looking at faces of their own race. So it starts really early. And, it's also partly a function of the fact, that we're living in segregated spaces. So maybe, I don't know if you have any children, but
I do. I have one, and he's mixed. So I'm like, does he think I look more like him, or does he think his mom does? I don't know.
So again, it's a matter of exposure. It's a matter of experience. And so it's like, our brains are very, adaptable, and so we're like responding to what is in front of us, and sort of what our experience is like. And so your child may not show this kind of effect, right? Like your child might be equally able to distinguish white faces and Chinese faces, for example. But for a lot of people, we're growing up in homes that are segregated racially. Oftentimes we're growing up in neighborhoods that are segregated racially. And so you don't get that exposure. And so your brain becomes better and better at distinguishing among faces that it's presented with, and then worse and worse at being able to distinguish among faces that, it's not presented with. And so that's the basic finding there. We've done neuroimaging studies on this as well. Actually, I work with a team of neuroscientists at Stanford who were interested in memory. And so what we did is we put people in an imaging scanner and we showed them faces, black and white faces. And we had black and white study participants in the scanner. And we were interested in how the brain would respond when they were looking at faces of their own race versus faces of a different race. And there's this area of the brain called the fusiform face area, or they call it the FFA. And so that's where we were looking in particular to see if there was a difference. And there was, the fusiform face area was much more active when people were watching or looking at faces of their own race than if they were looking at faces of a different race.
So our brains are better at recognizing familiarity. Do we know why we might have evolved this? Because it seems like just not important on its face to be able to see. I mean, is it just so kids can recognize their parents? Like, what is this for?
Well, it seems like race wouldn't be important, right?
Right.
So that's why, when we first started this study, a lot of neuroscientists thought we wouldn't find anything because they felt like face is a face, and the brain just evolved to recognize faces because faces are important to us. We want to be able to distinguish friend from foe, like someone who is going to do us harm versus someone who, is we're familiar with, and so forth. And so, as a matter of survival, to some extent, we have to be able to recognize faces, but they didn't think race had anything to do with that. But it turns out that it did, and that's because it's not just about evolution; it's also about exposure. It's also about experience, and so there's this neuroplasticity, right? That the
Right.
brain has, and so we have this ability to adapt to our circumstances. And if we're growing up in the world or in an environment where race is important, our brain kind of adapts to that.
It also works with children. I noticed that in the book, people who work with children can tell babies apart more easily. And when I had my son Jaden, he unsurprisingly he looked like an old Chinese man because he's a newborn and he's half Asian. But then I noticed that all my friends' kids, regardless of race, just looked like different shades of old Chinese men,
Yeah.
kind of. And I thought, like, oh my gosh, this would be really easy to mess up. Like if you have three people who are of the same or similar skin tone and they have kids in that nursery, I mean,
Yeah.
your guess is as good as mine. I wouldn't have been able to tell my own son apart from most newborn kids at first.
Right.
But nurses sort of, I won't say evolve, I guess they develop the ability to really tell baby features apart. I guess they're looking
Right.
at different things.
Right. Yeah, you can become an expert at whatever, it is that you're exposed to. So they're exposed to infant faces. They can tell those faces apart over time. They've even done this with teachers, right, who are, teaching in grade school. Those teachers are able to tell, 8-year-old faces apart from one another more so than college kids are who don't have any kids, right? So it's then you could really see that I think a lot of times people think about, well, if it's in the brain, that means it's stable and it's something that's evolved to be that way, that it's permanent, but it's not. The brain actually can is always evolving in a way, right? It's always responding to sort of what it's confronted with.
And blind people's brains, you've noted, repurpose, and I put that in air quotes, right? They repurpose their visual cortex. And we've seen brain data from, is it London cabbies, where that when they learned the knowledge of all the streets, their brains visibly change within just a few years. And I know we've actually got some London cabbies that listen to this podcast all the time. Shout out to the London cabbies who never get lost. We got to put you guys in a brain scanner next time I come to town. That to me shows.
The problem, though, now is that with all the technology, they don't have to memorize 25,000 streets anymore. And so their brains probably don't change, even though they're still, in the same profession. So the requirements are different.
Yeah. This also kind of goes, there's a flip side to this. And I thought this was kind of fascinating. This gang of purse snatchers. Can you take us through this? This was like a weirdly like a gang of thieves using neuroscientists. I can't say this. A gang of thieves using neuroscience somehow to get away with crime, which I'm guessing that was a little bit more of an accident, but I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So this was a time when I was in Oakland, California. I was there to try to help the police department with their reform efforts, and so
Hmm.
I learned about this crime spree that was going on in Chinatown, where it was basically black teenagers and young black men who were going into Chinatown, and they were snatching the purses of middle-aged Chinese women. And when they were asked, after being caught, like why they would focus on Chinatown and why those women, they would say, well, because the Chinese people can't tell the brothers apart. Basically, and so they knew that if they went there, that they wouldn't be able to ID them, and if they couldn't ID them, they were, able to do this and not get caught. So
And they eventually, obviously, they get caught because we have video cameras now because it's not 1950 and like you can just show the person is there. But I thought that was really this is clearly like kind of the same thing that was happening with me, right? Like, oh, who was it? I don't know. It was the dark skinned guy. Like, okay, there's 3 black men in the lineup that look nothing. One has dreads and one is bald. Which one was it? I can't tell. Um, so it does
it's
it
funny too, because that was happening to me when I moved to that neighborhood when I was 12, and I could not tell the difference between someone who had blonde hair and someone who had brown hair, blue eyes versus brown eyes. I just wasn't really focused on those kinds of features to
Mhm.
figure out who was who, and so it took me some time to even notice that was a relevant feature, right? To be able to
Yeah.
distinguish among faces.
There was a study that you mentioned in the book about how I'm going to phrase this in a weird way, but our brain essentially sort of dulls our response after we see something over and over. Can you take us through this? I want to know what this tells us about categories in our brains and what this might contribute to racism or racist attitudes.
Yeah, so this was another neural imaging study we did where we showed people faces in a scanner, and we found so there's this concept called repetition suppression, where again, like you said, the brain there's less of a response to stimuli that the brain is sort of seeing over and over and over again, right? And so what we did is that we showed people the faces of people who were white and black, and then some of the faces were repeated, and some weren't. And what we found is that if you show white people different white faces, you get a pretty strong response because it's a different white face. But if you show them the same white face over and over and over again, then you start to see that the response is less strong to that repeated showing of the same face. But what we found with black faces is when you show white people black faces, you get that dulling of the response, even when it's not the same face that you're seeing. So it's almost as though, even though they're different faces, right? They're different people that you're seeing each time. It's almost as though, you're shown a black face and then another black face and another black face and another black face. So it's almost sort of seen as the same stimulus, even though it's not, because it's being categorized as black, and you're sort of thinking about the face as black, and you're getting another one and another one and another one, basically. So the idea here is we were seeing some evidence that black faces are sort of seen categorically, by people who were outside that group, in this case, white participants, whereas same race faces are seen, they're individuated, right? You're able to treat one different from the other, and that's reflected in how responsive your brain is to them.
That's interesting. So we just kind of lump other races together in our brains and go, oh, well, these people are all the same. It's unconscious, right? It's our brain just doing it. Like, all right, well, all these people go in one pile, but everybody who kind of looks like me goes in 100,000 separate little, or 200 separate little piles.
That's right. I mean, you get this too, right? When people are so, they know that they do that, right? When they see Chinese faces or African American faces or what have you, but they don't expect that people do that to them. So white people, for example, are really surprised when I say, well, I couldn't tell white faces apart. They're like, what? I can't.
But they're so different.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
so different. And Chinese people say that to
Yeah.
me too. They read the book and they said, yeah, I had the hardest time when I came, like if they come to the country, when they're adults, and said they had the hardest time being able to distinguish among white faces. But people think their own group is just so rich and diverse, but not other groups so much.
It's comical in a way. It's a little sad, of course, but it's also comical to think that like, no, it's minorities that look all the same. White people, we are so diverse, and it's like, well, come on, man. That it's just ridiculous to think that. What really surprised me was that knowing someone's race as a category actually affected how we see their facial features. So this computer simulation with different haircuts, that kind of made me that was mind blowing that we could actually, well, tell us what this means, because I don't want to put conclusions on your work, especially if I don't fully understand it.
Actually, this was a study that was conducted by another social psychologist, Michael Zarati, and he was interested in, sort of, we've been talking a lot about bottom-up effects of the other race effect. And what I mean by bottom-up is just like experience-driven effects, right? But he was interested in the role of top-down processing. And so we're talking about the role that categorization can play in how we perceive faces. And what he did was he showed people the same face. And this is with Latino participants. And so either they saw the face and the face had a haircut that was like stereotypically Latino at the time. I think this was in the 80s when they did this study. Or it was the same face, but the face had a haircut that was stereotypically African-American. And so they were perceiving the face as either a face of a Black person or a face of a Latino, right? And they found that when they perceived the face as Latino, they could distinguish it a lot better when they perceived that same face, right? As African-American, because when he's African-American, he's an outgroup member, right? And so you're not processing, the face in the same way. You're not thinking about it in the same way. We might, sort of not, they're not these kind of fine-grained distinctions, really, right, that we're making. So that's what, they found. So it's not just our experience, it's also how we're taught to categorize people and to lump people in the same group. I had a friend, when I was in college, who had a sister who passed for white. So they were sisters, but my friend, she looked African-American, but the sister looked white, actually. But it was interesting because they had some of the same features. So even though the sister had blonde hair, she had the same forehead as my friend. She had the same eyes. She had the same lips. She had the same expression. She would make facial expressions, but no one ever confused them for sisters because they categorized one as white and the other as Black.
Wow. So in our minds, these people were in completely different buckets, even though there were objectively a lot of similarities.
A lot of similarities. And so the sister who was passing was never found out, even though people would meet her sister. Your sister's, I thought your sister's name was Marsha. Oh, that's interesting. She has the same name as your sister, not realizing that the Black sister was the sister, right? So
that's incredible. It also seems to confuse the way that we interpret emotion, right? So we might see, it causes confusion in perception, the way our brain creates stereotypes. Take us through this, because I can see this causing a lot of issues with policing and just reinforcing the stereotypes that people already have.
Yeah, so they've done studies. They've done studies showing that just like you have this other race effect that we're talking about, people are less able to read the expressions of people who are not in their race. So that causes a problem. So that number one. But then the second issue is that there are all these other studies showing that people are faster to read anger or aggression, right, into the faces of African Americans than they are into the faces of other people. So they've done studies where they will take a face, it's the same face, right, and they will gradually change the expression on the face. And so these are faces people are watching on a computer screen, and they see this face, and it might start out really angry, and then it goes to neutral, right? And so they have to say the moment at which that face goes to neutral. And they find that if it's a black face, people see the anger for longer. So it's like the anger, it sort of continues to bleed over even when the expression has gone to neutral. So it's just really interesting. They've done this also with biracial faces, that they tell people this face is, or this person is either black or white. And they find with the same face, if you're told that face or that person is black, the anger will linger longer on the face, even as the expression is changing to neutral.
Is it just faces, or is it also other body movements? Like if I'm wildly gesticulating, but I'm a nerdy white dude, am I going to be perceived in the same way as if I'm wildly gesticulating, but I'm the same build, same height, but I'm African American? Is that going to be judged as something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually trying to do research on that question right now. But if you look out, in the real world, there's some evidence for that. So, for example,
yeah, that's where I got the question, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, hey, how did you possibly think that this was an aggressive motion? Oh, because this person is a different race than you.
Right,
You know?
right. And we find like the NYPD, for example, when they were at the height of the stop and frisk practices there in New York, they were stopping lots and lots of African American and Latinos who lived there, especially. And one of the reasons they were stopping them was for furtive movement. And so what they mean by first of all, they didn't know what they meant by furtive movement. There was no agreed upon definition, of what furtive movement was in a department at that point. And so that left it to individual officers to decide for themselves what was furtive, what was suspicious movement. And so different officers could do that in different ways. And so what we were interested in is the role that race played in what they thought of as furtive. And we found that when you just look at black and white people who were stopped for furtive movement, 88% of them were African American and 12% were white. And then when we looked at how they were treated after being stopped for furtive movement, we found that African Americans were more likely to be, frisked. They were more likely to be subjected to physical force, even though they were no more likely to have a weapon. And in fact, only 1% of the people who were stopped for furtive movement actually had a weapon during the height of stop and frisk. And so that's what we found. And it's interesting because, even though this is the case, this is a pretty low hit rate, right? 1%, right? But, there was a lot of support for stop and frisk in New York at that time. And when we looked at why there was that much support, we found that the more people were sort of reminded of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. So, for example, the more Black they thought the prison population was, the more supportive they were of aggressive stop and frisk practices at the time. And so there was a way in which, disparities in the criminal justice system, for some people, you think, well, maybe there's something going on with the system. For other people, if you, sort of talk to them about disparities in the system, they see it as sort of evidence or justification that these people are doing wrong. And so therefore they need to be stopped. And so that's what we found.
Yeah, that I find that's the what is it? The vicious cycle. That's the term I'm looking for, right? Because if we have bias and then we constantly look to reinforce that bias, but then we also don't see that bias, well, then our bias just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And we don't think, geez, my subconscious or unconscious bias is really getting stronger due to all this evidence that I'm looking for unconsciously. We just think, well, clearly what I'm perceiving is the truth. What else could there be? And then anytime, and even if you sought to fight that in yourself, all your colleagues would be like, what are you doing thinking that maybe this isn't furtive gestures, but you're just succumbing to your unconscious bias. The one time you get stabbed by somebody, they're going to be like, you're an idiot. You brought this on yourself. What are you thinking? And of course, even in your own mind, you're going to go, okay, to hell with this. I'm not getting stabbed again because of my attempt to be less biased. That's not going to work. I wonder, is bias contagious? Can I get bias from somebody else?
I'm sorry. It's
Yeah,
funny. You could cut this out as we're
sure.
talking. I'm looking out my window, and somebody just came up and stole my husband's bicycle.
Do you want to go handle that
Oh,
or not?
he's
Probably.
gone now. I don't know.
What
Eh.
do you want to call the police? I got time if you want to. Like,
Can you cut
yeah, of
can you
course.
cut this
I
out?
won't. What did he look like?
He was not African American.
I was just making sure you're not biased.
Hold on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
He,
handle it. Handle it.
huh. Hey, Rick. So somebody, I think, just stole your bicycle from the driveway. Can you come outside and see? Because he walked up part of the way of the driveway, and then I saw him ride off on the bicycle. So, and I'm in the middle of a interview. So maybe you want to. He went to the right, and he just came up and got on the bike and rode off. Okay, all right, thanks. Bye. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Let me know if you need to do anything else. I'm happy to pause. That's weird. That's never happened. I've been doing this for 14 years. No one's witnessed a crime during the show.
And we're talking about crime as I'm witnessing it.
Yeah. Jeez, that's so weird. So he just had his bike like unlocked in the driveway and somebody saw it and was like, I'm gonna go ahead and take that.
Yeah.
That is brazen.
Yep.
Jeez. Yeah, let me know if you need to pause or anything. I'm happy. I have time, so it's all good.
Oh, okay. That's okay. I think my husband can handle it. I told him which way.
Yeah.
That's all I saw is the way he went. So.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, I don't know where are you in Palo Alto? Are you near Stanford?
Actually, we live on Stanford's campus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, because I was gonna say in any town that's not a college town, I would not chase a thief. But in a college town, half the time you chase somebody down and they're like, oh, and they're either drunk or they're just like, ah, crap, okay. But yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, it is. Okay, I'm just telling him what he had
Yeah,
on because
of course. No, take your time. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll just jump. We'll jump right back into it.
Okay, let's go. Sorry about that.
Okay, sure, no problem. Is bias contagious? Can I catch it from other people? Can I absorb it by working with other people? Because that would explain bias in families or, racism and stereotypes in families and organizations, such as, well, any organization, really. It doesn't have to be the police, right? Is bias contagious or does it not quite work that way?
Well, yeah, actually, some people believe it is, and there's some research to, suggest that it is as well. So, for example, Christina Olson and colleagues, they actually did this with really young children, where they exposed them to a videotape of someone who was treating another person either poorly, by kind of scowling at them and leaning away from them and that kind of thing, or they were treating them really, really positively. So they were leaning forward and they were smiling and they handed them a toy and all of this. And so then, so they had preschoolers watch this videotape of all this going on. These were like, 3-year-olds, say. And they found that, when they asked the 3-year-olds which person they liked the person who was treated well, but disliked the person who was not treated well, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
so when they were asked, well, who would you want to share a toy with? It was the person, who was liked, not the person who was disliked. So, so they watched this clip for seconds, right? And already they could pick up on what was not just what was happening, but they made an assessment about it. So if you're treated badly, that means you're a bad person. If you're treated well, that means you're a good person. And so they were, it's interesting. They were blaming the target of the bias, for the bias rather than the holder of the bias. And so that's one study where you could see how that's contagious if you're watching
Yeah.
especially as a kid, and you're learning like who is nice and who is good and who to approach and so forth based on how you're treated by others, the bias of others. There's also some other research by Nalini Ambati and colleagues where they were looking at this in adults, and they were interested in the role of media as being a way that bias can be contagious. And so what they did is they looked at popular television shows that people watched, and And they didn't look at shows where, Black people were in sort of negative positions, right? Or, positions where they were the criminal or something like that. They looked at shows where African Americans were represented in positive ways, and, where they had roles as strong characters like doctors and lawyers and so forth. And what they did was that they looked at how that Black actor was being treated by other people on the set. And so, again, this is like nonverbal leakage. And so they weren't, sort of looking at blatant stuff. They were just looking at the kinds of expressions that people had when they were watching that Black actor, or again, their body movement, or whether they were leaning in or not, that kind of thing. And they found that when these actors, and so these are other cast members, right? When they were watching a Black actor, they were sort of treating them in a more negative way in terms of their nonverbal expressions and so forth. And not only did they find that, they found that when, if there were the people who were watching that show, especially people who watch the show regularly and so forth, they caught the biases that were being sort of admitted by the people who the cast, the other cast members. So just watching the show led to an increase in your own implicit or unconscious bias. So that's what they found.
Wow, it seems like a lot of this is survival mechanisms gone wrong, right? Like little kids or adults, if I see somebody being treated negatively, that might help me not become a victim of that person or suffer at the hands of that person. But if we're also then putting people into buckets in a totally arbitrary / unfair way based on just a few qualities that they have because we're unfamiliar with them, then you have this kind of 1-2 punch of, well, I'm just going to paint everyone with the same brush. Oh, and I'm also painting this one person or treating this one person negatively. Therefore, I'm going to treat everybody who kind of looks like that person negatively as well. That sounds like a recipe for racism, kind of just right there.
Yeah, I mean, and you could imagine what kind of harm that does, right? When you have that, I mean, and it is something that and it's not even something that's limited to people. Dogs do this as well, and so
really,
yeah,
dogs
so
are also racist. That's weird.
Well, well, you can imagine how dogs could become racist, for example.
Sure.
So, there's not a lot of sort of systematic, like rigorous research on racism with dogs. Yeah, you do see that dogs pay attention to what their owners do, and so they had a study where they brought a dog, the owner of the dog and the dog together into the laboratory, and then someone came into the lab, and the dog owner was told to take either 3 steps back or to take 3 steps forward. And they found that when the dog owner took the 3 steps back, the dog became really agitated, and they, looking back and forth between the owner and this person who came into the room. They were worried. They were like, sort of barking. They were, so they were worried, that the owner was in harm's way. And so, you think like, so if a dog can pick this up, like our own, like, the nonverbals and all of this, you can certainly imagine that, other people can pick up the nonverbals of people who are responding maybe negatively to people because of their race.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Whenever I used to hear like, oh, my dog's really good at reading people. And then you also hear like, oh, well, this dog or that dog is a little bit racist. And now when someone's like, oh, my dog is afraid of Black people, I'm always like, it's your golden retriever that's afraid of Black people, is it? That checks out, and it's weird because people don't even see it, but that goes back to bias, right? They go, oh, well, this dog is a little bit afraid of so-and-so, or they're afraid of strangers. And I'm just thinking, because when I walk up to dogs, they usually, like if I'm outside and I see my neighbor's dog, they're so friendly. How come it's just your dog that seems to have a problem with certain people? But no, it gets along great with your family, or your extended family that they've seen twice in their life. So it just doesn't make sense. So that data, that shines a bright light on a lot of what's going on. I never knew it was the 2 steps forward or the stepping forward, stepping backward, but that makes sense because I was thinking, how the dog can't really see my face? Like, what is he reacting to? And it's proximity, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep.
How do we mitigate bias? Because I know you do a lot of police training or organizational training and things like that, but does training mitigate bias, or does it just build awareness to it? Because as you know better than anyone, these two things are not the same. We can't just know we have bias and then magically not be affected by it. Kind of like what I said about gravity earlier in the show.
Right, that's true. And I think a lot of people feel like if you just bring in someone to inform people about bias, that bias can go away because now everybody understands, what it is. But yeah, like you said, you need to do more than that. The other issue with the bias training is that people will, they will bring people in, but they won't evaluate the training. And so oftentimes, like in police departments, for example, this is a pretty common thing. Also, community members will push departments to, offer this training to officers because they're worried about bias, they're worried about how they're being treated and so forth. And so the department will offer this training, but very rarely is it evaluated. And then to the extent that it is evaluated, it's, did you like the training, right? It's not the
Useful.
metric, that is the most helpful or useful metric. It's certainly not the metric that people have in mind when they're pushing for the bias training. They want, there to be bias training because they want to improve police community interactions, because they want more just policing. And rarely do you have bias training that is evaluated using those metrics. And so I feel like we need to change that because, it's a, I mean, one thing, people will say, well, it can't harm people, right, to have this bias training that so now they have information that they didn't have, even if it doesn't, change their biases. But in some ways, it might, right? Because if you're doing that instead of doing other things that actually could move the needle, then that's a problem. It could, just offering that training could make it less likely that you're going to look at making changes to the culture, in that police department. It could make it less likely that you're going to re-examine enforcement practices. It could make it less likely that you re-examine the policies that you have. And so it could, in some way, actually lead to a problem, especially if you're only doing this bias training in isolation and then not even looking at how that training actually really changes outcomes, the outcomes that you care about.
There are a lot of studies that you wrote about in the book, Biased, that were really shocking and kind of bring into question the way that we even look at our own perception, our own brains, right? There was one that said, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, your conclusion, but studies rate people's perception of, let's say, African American people as taller and heavier. And I had to read that a few times because I thought, so am I literally seeing Black people as larger and heavier than they actually are? Like, how is that possible that what I am seeing, and we've studied this on the show before, or discussed this on the show about how our eyes are bringing in photons and then our brain does the rest of it and calculates the image. So this bias it's not just like a background program that's running and affects some of our thoughts. I'm literally seeing, hearing, feeling, whatever, different things. It's almost like it gets between my eye and the rest of my thinking brain and just messes with the data.
Right. And it's similar to what we were talking about with the expressions, right?
Right.
You see a Black face, you're seeing it as angrier for longer. If you see a Black person, you're seeing that body as stronger, as more muscular, as heavier. As more threatening, really. So researchers have found that, and they also have found that that actually affects your endorsement of use of force against the Black person. So people who are thinking that Black bodies are heavier and stronger and more muscular feel like it's more justified, for example, for officers to use more extreme force against Black people.
Right, like I feared for my life. He's so much bigger than me. He's 3.5 pounds heavier and he's a centimeter shorter than you. Like, what are you talking about? But if we actually see the person as he was 6'5", 280, it's like, well, wait a minute. And it wasn't just a small amount. What else really kind of was scary was you wrote in part, when we see Black faces, we're more likely to quickly see a gun or a weapon, even if it's not there. And conversely, when we see white faces, we're slower to see a gun, even if it is there. So we see people of different races as armed when they're not, and people who we assume are safer races as safer, even if objectively they're not, and it's visually present for, like, if you have enough. Was this study like, okay, we have all the time in the world, we can see that this is a white guy with a gun, or we have all the time in the world, we can see this is a African-American male who's unarmed, but in a short amount of time, the data just gets all shook up in a tumbler and then thrown out. It's crazy to me. It just messes with our perceptions, literally.
Yeah, especially like like you said, when you don't have time to respond, you're forced to rely on these well-practiced associations. And so if you associate Black people with crime, that's at the ready, right? And so you're going to say, okay, yeah, this person has a gun. You're going to respond. So they've done this with these shoot, don't shoot simulations. And so they are quicker to respond shoot to a Black person with a gun than a white person with a gun. So yeah, but it's only when you're pushed to respond quickly. So you're using your intuitions about, what's happening, and that's driving your response rather than, sort of pausing and sort of looking to see what's happening. But sometimes people have to make split-second decisions.
Sure.
And that's why the work is relevant.
To undo that must be, I mean, that's the science magic wand that we're probably looking for, right? Where we can just be objective about what we see, because you almost have to take, like, I don't know, a few 100,000 years of evolution out of the equation and train people to do it really, really, really fast. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah.
Right? I also found it surprising that even homes and real estate seemingly are not exempt from prejudice. Obviously, a house can't be racist, but tell me about how bias affects real estate and homes. I've never thought about this. Of course, this is your line of work, but this was shocking and disappointing as well, right?
Yeah, well, people have, like, social scientists, especially sociologists, have they've been studies for a long time now showing that, homes in Black neighborhoods are worth less than comparable homes in white neighborhoods, that kind of thing. But what we wanted to do is to look at the identical house and only change the owner to see if for the same house, people are seeing it differently and evaluating it in a different way. And so we ran a controlled study on this. We actually used house hunters on Craigslist. And so we, told these house hunters that we had the study. We were interested in how people evaluate homes online. And so they agreed to do the study. And the house that we showed them was a house that was owned by the Thomas family. And we changed the Thomas family so that they were depicted as either Black or as white. And they were standing in the living room of the house. And so they were seeing these pictures of the home, but they see the Thomas family standing in the living room, and that family's Black or that family's white. All of the other pictures are identical, right? So they're seeing the outside of the home, they're seeing the bathroom, the kitchen, the bedroom, the backyard, everything is the same, right? And then we ask people to evaluate the house. And we find that they evaluate the house more negatively when there was a Black family standing in it. So,
Wow.
they think that the house, they're less interested in the house. They even say that more would need to be done to the house to spruce it up, to get it ready for the market, if a Black family is standing in it than if the white family is standing in that same house. So that's what we found. And we've also found that, the thing that was interesting, I should say, about this is that for this, we did lots of different versions of the study, but for this particular version, we're finding that, just seeing a single Black family leads you to imagine the whole neighborhood in a different way. So exposure to that Black Thomas family led you to imagine a neighborhood that was more run down, that was more crime ridden, that had poorer schools, that had sort of less the shopping district, there would be less opportunities there, fewer banking, institutions, all of that. But we didn't give them any information at all about the surrounding neighborhood. Mm-hmm. All they had, they only had these pictures of the house and the family. And just seeing that family brought online like this whole vision about where the house was located and what that neighborhood must look like. They said they would feel less attached to that neighborhood that they didn't even see just because that Black family was standing in it. And we had another version where we just told them that there were Black people who lived in the neighborhood, and they were willing to pay 20 that they would pay $20,000 less for that house if they knew there were Black people around than if they knew there were white people around. So it's just yeah, it's pretty deep, right? It for us,
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting because it shows that stereotyping goes beyond just your beliefs and your attitudes about people. It can
Yeah.
also affect the things that those that those people are connected to, the homes that they're connected to, right? So it makes it so that it's a much broader phenomenon. It's not only about people, but it can come online in all these other ways, and can influence where people live. It could also influence the wealth of those families, because wherever they live, people don't want to pay as much for it just because they lived in that house. And so that's, yeah, you can imagine lots of implications there.
Yeah, of course. And also the idea, this sort of carries over into what you'd called whitening resumes as well, right? Like there's bias even with resumes and getting jobs. Just briefly, can you kind of discuss that? I think a lot of people, sure, if you see a really obviously ethnic sounding name, you can tell, but what else is going on when I'm looking at a resume? Like how is bias coming through something like that?
Yeah, so this was research that was conducted by Sonia Kong and colleagues. So they are, people who like organizational behavior, professors, and I think she's at the University of Toronto now. And what they did was that they basically had interviewed lots of people on college campuses, and these were mostly elite college campuses. And they discovered that there was a real worry that these college graduating seniors had about bias in the labor market. And so that led them to what they call whiten the resume. And so, Jamal Anthony Smith, on the resume might be J. Anthony Smith. And so you change the name so that, you are kind of downplaying your identity. And they found this not just with African Americans, but also with Asian Americans. And in fact, Asian Americans, they were more likely to use their American sounding nicknames. And then they were also told by, career counselors and so forth that they would get more callbacks if they did that than if they used their Chinese birth name, for example.
Mm,
And the the kicker is that when they actually developed like all of these resumes and whitened some of them and left others unwhitened, and they sent them out to employers, and they found that the hunches that these college students had, actually they were correct. Whitened resumes did indeed receive more callbacks from employers than unwhitened resumes. And this was the case even for people who, these companies who said they cared about diversity and inclusion. There was
sure.
no difference there.
We
So,
care about diversity and inclusion, especially if it's somebody else's problem, right? Or like somebody else has to deal with it, or like maybe in your company, like not in my department. Yeah, there's a lot of that. What do they call that? Not in my backyard kind of situation. That's not exactly the same thing. Have you heard this before?
I don't know if I'm following you exactly, but
It's
but what?
it's like
Go
It's
ahead.
like when people in San Francisco say, I really care about homelessness. We really got to clean up the Tenderloin. And it's like, yeah, why don't we take some of these folks and move them over to
Right.
like Nob Hill? And they're like, well, not here. How about some other neighborhood, right? They call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard, where it's like, we need to let in all the people who want to come to America. Cool. Let's move them to, Palo Alto. Let's move them to Detroit instead.
Yeah, I mean, and also, I mean, in this case with the college students, it led them to signal that they would fit in, like they
Hmm.
could, um, you know, uh, they would fit in culturally. So, for example, with Asian Americans, they they would change their hobbies and the things that they like to do and all of that to things that were more palatable to white Americans. So they would say they like to ski, and they like to go camping, and they'd like to go waterboarding or whatever you call those sports. I don't even
waterboarding. That's a white people thing right there. You mean wakeboarding, but I got it.
You call it waterboarding? Is that
waterboarding is something you do to torture terrorists, but
okay.
what?
Okay, what is that called?
Wakeboarding, but wakeboarding. I'm just now realizing that all of my friends' hobbies are so white. Wakeboarding, skiing, camping. I guess black people don't wakeboard and camp. Like I'm learning this right now. Yeah. Have you seen this? I sent you this article actually. It's about orchestras and bias, and they started doing these blind auditions where they would say, "Hey, look, we need more diversity. Let's put the person who's auditioning behind like a curtain, so we don't know if they're a man or a woman. We don't know if they're Asian, black, white. We're just going to do blind auditions." And now they're finding that somehow that made things less diverse. I'm not sure how that's even possible. I guess what's going on there?
Yeah, we were focused on gender diversity there, right? Because at the time, the vast majority of orchestras were, white and male, and
surprise.
Yeah, so this
old
was
white guys playing the violin.
Yep. So this was in the 70s, and so it was a real problem, and so they decided to actually institute these blind auditions where people could not see the person who was auditioning, at all, right? And so they would put that curtain down and they would play. And so it actually did lead to real change for women. So I think it 50% more women made it beyond the sort of entry level interview. 25, I think now, in fact, I think about 25% of the musicians who are in these, big orchestras are women. So it did actually lead to some success, and people like to hail that as a, as a way to deal with bias, right? But the problem with it is that there is. You're dealing with bias by being blinded to the person's identity, and so once she enters the orchestra, it's clear, that she's a woman, and how does that change the dynamics? And I had read, in one of these news articles that, there was a woman who was suing the orchestra for gender bias in terms of pay. So the the issues can continue, and so just making people blind to identity doesn't solve everything. People like to think about this, color blindness also.
Yeah,
to deal
I was going to bring that up. Like, I don't see color. And it's like, well, that's not helping anyone, right?
Yeah, it's not. But then people are taught that, okay, if I don't see color, I can't be biased, right? But research, on this shows that that's not the case. And actually, it's the opposite, right? So they've done research with fourth and fifth graders showing that, when you encourage, these kids to value diversity, say, they can spot blatant instances of discrimination. But when you take a group of kids and you encourage them to be colorblind, only half of them can actually spot instances of blatant discrimination. So what they're finding is that, when you're trying to teach children to not see color, they also don't see the discrimination that comes with color. So it ends up leading people to be sort of more likely to be harmed, by, discrimination rather than less likely. And so there's a lot of research on this. Actually, a lot of people are doing work on color blindness, and much of the work is showing that there's a cost, a real cost to color blindness, actually.
What about the old "some of my best friends are black" trope, right? Like, there's a lot of, I think a lot of companies are even getting bias training to kind of check the box, right? Like, you even hear about this. There's blogs and articles written online about how bias training at such and such company was a bunch of crap, and everybody just kind of like did it because HR made them go. And it seems like that would make things worse. Like, oh, well, our company's not discriminating, in against resumes that aren't white enough because we had bias training 3 Thursdays in a row. Like
Right.
that could make kind of makes things worse. Or moral licensing, right? Like the concept that, well, we're doing the right thing with our bias training, so we can afford to maybe only hire good-looking young white people to work in the front of the house or the front office because that's the image we want to portray. But we're not racist because we had bias training 3 Thursdays in a row.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. My colleague Benoit Monin does a lot of work on this sort of moral credentialing, right?
Hmm.
Where you've done a good thing in the past, and so that gives you credit in the bank to do more bad things, in the
Hmm.
future. And so they're finding, like more recently, that it's not just individuals do this, but like you said, companies will do this as well. So that's what we were talking about before, right? That there could be a harm to actually having the trainings, not just that they don't work as well as we might think, but it could also prevent, companies from doing the things that they should to really, address the issue.
Yeah, I'm wary of whether it works. It seems like now it's probably the rage, the industry of bias training, right? It's like, I don't know if it's a new industry, but certainly right now it's going to be very de rigueur, right? Like a lot of this almost seems like low ROI or low cost image and brand management. It's run by people who decided last week that they were going to do bias training because they read your book and some articles on Google and they're like, I can do bias training now. Not run by scientists.
Right,
It's
that's true too. I mean, it's a big business. There are a lot of consultants out, who are doing this across the country.
yeah.
The vast majority of it actually is not run by scientists. So that's part of the issue with having more systematic evaluations of it. So it would be great if we had those, right? Because we could tell like which trainings actually are effective, which aren't, why. We can, really delve into this. But yeah, I think it's a great thing for companies to do. Um,
Maybe you start credentialing people who are doing bias training and make sure it passes the sniff test. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you're
Well,
right. We should raise the bar for what counts.
right, raise the bar. That's right. What can we do? In closing here, what can we do to mitigate bias? If we're wired for it, we can't shrug it off because we're wired for it. What on earth can we actually do about it?
So yeah, so we're wired for it, we're vulnerable to it, but that doesn't mean we're going to act on it all the time. So our context, our environment can either amp up the bias and make it more likely, or it can or it can make it less likely. And so that's what we want to help people to understand, that it's something that can be triggered by your environment. So if you know what those triggers are, you have more control over it. Like there's something that you can actually do about it. So for example, there was. Let me give you one. I'll give you some. We're talking a lot about policing. I can give you an example there. So, working with people from the police department here in California, in the Oakland Police Department, we were able to reduce the number of stops made by officers, of people who weren't committing any serious crimes. And we did this by adding a simple question to the form that officers complete when they're engaging in a stop, and that is this stop intelligence led, yes or no? And what they mean by intelligence led is that, did I have prior information to tie this particular person to a specific crime, right? And we found that just sort of pushing officers to answer that question before they make the stop, they pause, right? They slow down. They are sort of using evidence of wrongdoing in place of their intuition. And that's what you want, right? To have them.
Hmm.
And we found that by just adding that question, it really did reduce the number of stops officers made, and African American stops alone fell by over 43%. And the crime rate didn't go up. So there was a fear that you needed to stop that many Black people to keep the crime rate down. But it turns out that the crime rate did not go up when you stopped fewer Black people. The city wasn't more dangerous, and actually it became more safe.
Well, thank you very much for your time and expertise in the middle of your, very personal experience with a crime being perpetrated upon you. That's there's a first time for everything. The The book was great. It's called Biased. We'll link to it in the show notes for people that want to check it out. You know what? Actually, this might make sense to close with this. I mean, you have very personal experience as well with bias. If memory serves, the first time you heard yourself called Dr. Eberhardt was from a judge.
Yeah.
Can you give us the short version of that? That was a kind of a crazy story.
Well, yeah, the short version is it was the day before I graduated from Harvard with a PhD in psychology, and I was pulled over by a cop, and turns out he thought that my tags were expired, and he ended up calling a tow truck and arresting us. I was with a friend, so that's why I say arresting us. And so we ended up getting arrested for expired tags, basically, or so we thought. I ended up, getting we were actually handcuffed and sort of taken into the precinct and handcuffed to a wall and all of that. So it was just a horrific experience. I was let go, and I was able to go to my commencement and all that, but with bruises and so forth. But then the next day I had to appear in court, and it was in court that I learned that this officer had, accused of us of what do you call it? Assault and battery on a police officer, because when he reached in to unbuckle my seatbelt to arrest me, I touched his hand with my finger. And so anyway, so we were shocked to learn that, and it turns out that the judge just threw the case out and basically looked at me and said, "Dr. Eberhardt, you are free to go." And that was the first time someone called me Dr. Eberhardt.
That's like, it sounds, it's a little humorous in the beginning, but then you realize just how sad it is. Like, there should have been like the happiest moment, one of the happiest moments of your life. You just finished a decade or something or more of research at one of the hardest schools in the world. And it's like the person using your title for you first is it's not the dean, the regent, your family. It's the judge saying, "Oh, look, you're not a criminal because you have this whole thing is a bunch of crap, and you got a PhD from Harvard that says studying this exact thing." I mean, it's just a cruel irony in a weird way. Sad irony.
It was indeed.
Well, Dr. Eberhardt, thank you very much once again for your time. I hope you get your bike back.
I have the sense you're going to air that part.
I have to now, right? Like,
it's funny.
It's such a weird thing to happen during a live show. It's just so bizarre.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there you go.
Yes. Thank you so much. This was really great. I really do appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback from the audience on this as well. If you like this interview, there's a lot more just like it on the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. You can find that in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. Now, click here for an interview with superstar investor Ray Dalio. Click here for an interview with FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. And click down here to subscribe to the channel.